Nothing burns worse than the smug smirk of an ex-husband waving a 3-carat diamond in your face. But revenge isn't always served with shouting or shattered glass. Sometimes it's served in absolute silence, on a private tarmac, while the man who broke you watches you fly away with a Titan. The ambient hum of the JFK Centurion Lounge was supposed to be a sanctuary, a barrier of exclusivity separating the weary traveller from the chaos of Terminal 4. For Flora Sinclair, it was merely a quiet place to finish her matcha latte before the real journey began. Flora was a woman who took up space, and for the first 30 years of her life, she had apologized for it. She was softly built, with generous curves and a quiet, observing nature. Today, she was wrapped in a camel-colored Max Mara cashmere coat. Her feet slipped into understated Loro Piana loafers. There were no prominent logos on her body, no flashing neon signs of wealth, just the quiet, immaculate tailoring of a woman who had finally learned her own worth. 2 years ago, she wouldn't have dared sit here so comfortably. 2 years ago, she was Flora Mercer, the dutiful, anxious wife of Daniel Mercer, a mid-level vice president at a tech firm who treated his life like a meticulously curated LinkedIn profile. "I need a woman who looks the part, Flora," Daniel had told her on a chilly Tuesday in their sterile, minimalist kitchen. He had been knotting his silk tie, refusing to look her in the eye. "I'm moving up. I have clients to entertain. And let yourself go. You don't fit the image anymore." He had weaponized her weight, chipping away at her self-esteem until she felt like a guest in her own marriage. When he filed for divorce, he fought dirty, hiding assets and leaving her with a mountain of legal debt, convinced she would quietly fade into obscurity, broken and penniless. She hadn't. Flora turned a page of her book, her mind drifting to the present, when a loud, braying laugh sliced through the sophisticated murmur of the lounge. She didn't need to look up. Her stomach gave a phantom lurch. She knew that laugh. It was the sound of a man making sure everyone in the room knew he had arrived. "I told the TSA agent. Look at the boarding pass, buddy. It says Delta 1. Daniel's voice carried over the clinking of porcelain cups. Flora lowered her book. Walking past the frosted glass partition was Daniel. He looked exactly the same, perhaps a bit more hollow around the cheeks, his bespoke suit tailored just a fraction too tight in an effort to look youthful. Clinging to his arm was a woman who looked like a walking Instagram filter. She was rail-thin, draped in an oversized blazer, and carrying a Louis Vuitton Neverfull bag that hit against her hip with every aggressive step. This was Jessica Kensington, the woman Daniel had told Flora not to worry about. The new hire who needed mentoring. Flora felt a brief, icy spike of adrenaline, the old trauma response flaring up. But then, as quickly as it came, the panic dissolved. She took a slow sip of her tea. She wasn't that frightened girl anymore. She placed her book down and casually crossed her legs, waiting. It took exactly 3 minutes for Daniel to spot her. He was at the buffet, complaining loudly to Jessica about the quality of the smoked salmon, when he turned and his eyes locked onto Flora. For a split second, he looked panicked. Then, the old, familiar arrogance washed over his face. A cruel, opportunistic gleam lit up his eyes. He tapped Jessica's arm, whispered something in her ear, and both of them turned to look at Flora. Jessica's eyes raked over Flora's seated, curved figure, her lips curling into a microscopic sneer. They began to walk over. It was a predatory stroll. Daniel was coming to gloat. "Well, well, well, if it isn't Flora," Daniel said, stopping just inches from her table. He shoved his hands into his pockets, rocking back on his heels. "I have to admit, seeing you in the first-class lounge is a surprise." Did you win a raffle?" Flora looked up, her expression placid. "Hello, Daniel. It's been a while." "Not long enough, clearly," Jessica chimed in, her voice high and raspy. She shifted her weight, making sure her designer belt buckle caught the light. "Daniel has told me so much about you. You look comfortable." The word comfortable was a thinly veiled jab at Flora's size. It was the kind of passive-aggressive language Daniel had always encouraged. "I am," Flora replied simply, her voice low and steady. She didn't adjust her coat. She didn't suck in her stomach. She simply existed, unbothered, looking at them as if they were a mildly interesting exhibit at a museum. Daniel frowned. This wasn't the reaction he wanted. He wanted her to shrink. He wanted tears or anger or jealousy. He cleared his throat, leaning in closer. "We're heading to Milan, a little pre-wedding celebration. We figured we'd treat ourselves before the big day." He waited for the bomb to drop. Flora merely raised an eyebrow. "Congratulations." "Show her, Jess," Daniel prompted, his chest puffing out. Jessica didn't need to be told twice. She thrust her left hand forward, practically shoving it into Flora's line of sight. Resting on her bony, manicured finger was a massive, ostentatious diamond ring. It was a princess-cut stone, surrounded by a thick, blinding halo of smaller diamonds set on a double pavé band. It was loud, chaotic, and desperately screaming for attention. 3.5 carats, Jessica beamed, her eyes darting to Flora's bare hands. "Daniel is just so generous. He told me he wanted to finally buy a ring for a woman who could actually pull it off. You know, someone who fits into the high society circles we're moving in now." The insult hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Daniel watched Flora closely, a cruel smirk playing on his lips, waiting for the devastating blow to register. "It's very noticeable," Flora said gently, offering a polite, almost pitying smile. "It certainly suits you, Jessica." Daniel's smirk faltered. He hated that she wasn't breaking. "It cost a fortune, but Jess is worth it. What about you, Flora? Still living in that cramped little walk-up in Queens? Still doing whatever little freelance writing gigs you were doing?" "I'm doing well, Daniel. Thank you for asking." "You know," Daniel continued, lowering his voice into a tone of mocking sympathy, "if you're struggling to afford a decent flight, you should have called. I might have been able to get you a buddy pass or something. I'm an executive director now, you know. They take very good care of me. Where are you flying anyway? Economy to see your sister in Ohio." Before Flora could answer, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere of the lounge. The heavy mahogany doors at the far end swung open, and the lounge manager, a normally stoic, unflappable man, practically sprinted across the room. He bypassed Daniel and Jessica entirely, coming to a breathless halt beside Flora's chair. "Ms. Sinclair," the manager said, his voice trembling slightly with reverence. "I sincerely apologize for the intrusion, but Mr. Sterling's security detail just radioed. His car has pulled up to the private terminal. He asked me to escort you directly to the tarmac. The jet is fully fueled and ready whenever you are." Daniel blinked, his brow furrowing. "Wait, what? Private terminal?" Jessica lowered her hand, the heavy diamond suddenly looking cheap under the lounge's warm lighting. "Who is Mr. Sterling?" she muttered. Flora calmly picked up her book and stood. At 5 feet 8 inches, in her slight heels, she looked Daniel dead in the eye. "Thank you, Richard. I'll be right there." Daniel let out a scoffing laugh, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Mr. Sterling? What, did you find yourself a sugar daddy, Flora? Someone to fund your little, comfortable lifestyle?" "Daniel, please," Flora said, a hint of genuine exhaustion in her voice. "You're embarrassing yourself. At that exact moment, heavy, measured footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor behind them. "Is there a problem here, darling?" The voice was a deep, resonant baritone that commanded absolute authority, the kind of voice that moved markets and silenced boardrooms. Daniel turned around, prepared to snap at whoever was interrupting him, but the words died in his throat. His face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. Standing there was Arthur Sterling. He was in his late 40s, tall, with striking silver at his temples and piercing, intelligent eyes. He wore a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford suit that draped flawlessly over his broad shoulders, exuding an aura of immense, quiet power. He wasn't just a billionaire. Arthur Sterling was the founder and CEO of Sterling Vanguard Holdings, a global private equity firm that bought and sold companies the way normal people bought groceries. Arthur walked past a frozen Daniel as if he were nothing more than a piece of uninteresting furniture. He stepped up to Flora, his entire demeanor softening the moment his eyes met hers. He reached out, gently cupping her cheek, and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. "I missed you," Arthur murmured, completely ignoring the two gaping statues standing inches away. The traffic on the FDR was abysmal. "Are you ready for St. Moritz?" "I am," Flora smiled, her face radiating a genuine warmth that Daniel hadn't seen in years. "I was just catching up with an old acquaintance." Arthur slowly turned his head, his sharp gaze locked onto Daniel. The warmth vanished, replaced by a chilling, calculating stare. Arthur's memory for faces and corporate hierarchies was legendary. "An old acquaintance," Arthur repeated smoothly. His eyes flicked down to Daniel's slightly ill-fitting suit, then to Jessica, and finally lingered on the gaudy ring she was still holding awkwardly in the air. "Daniel Mercer," Arthur said, the name rolling off his tongue with absolute indifference. "Vice President of Regional Sales at Apex Global. Yes, I reviewed your file last Tuesday." Daniel looked as though the floor had just vanished beneath him. He was trembling. You reviewed my file, Mr. Sterling?" Apex Global had been in a tailspin for months. The rumors of a hostile takeover had been swirling, causing panic throughout the corporate ranks. "We finalized the acquisition of Apex Global yesterday evening," Arthur stated coldly, wrapping a protective proprietary arm around Flora's waist. "I spent the morning deciding which departments to liquidate. Redundancy is such an ugly part of the business. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Mercer?" Daniel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jessica, finally realizing the gravity of the situation, instinctively took a step back from Daniel, her hand dropping to her side. "Darling," Arthur said, turning his attention entirely back to Flora, his voice instantly warming again. "The pilot said there's a weather window. We should go. I had the chef prepare those truffle tartlets you love so much." "That sounds wonderful, Arthur," Flora said. She picked up her leather tote bag. She didn't look back at Daniel. She didn't deliver a parting, venomous one-liner. She didn't need to. Her silence, her elegance, and the heavy, terrifying realization settling over her ex-husband were louder than any words she could have spoken. As Flora and Arthur walked away, escorted by the lounge manager and flanked by two silent security details, Daniel remained glued to the floor. He watched his chubby, discarded ex-wife step into a private elevator that he would never, ever have the clearance to use, while his fiancée stared at her 3-carat ring, suddenly aware that it might not be paid off after all. The Gulfstream G650ER climbed effortlessly into the stratospheric blue, the roar of the engines fading into a rhythmic, expensive purr. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of Bulgari white tea and fresh lilies. Flora sank into the buttery cream leather of her oversized captain's chair, watching the patchwork of New York City dissolve into a memory beneath the clouds. Arthur was across from her, his iPad resting on his knee, but his focus was entirely on her. He reached across the aisle, his large hand covering hers. "You're quiet, Flora," he said, his voice a low rumble that always seemed to vibrate right in her chest. "Did seeing him stir up ghosts you weren't ready for?" Flora looked at their joined hands. Arthur's skin was warm, his grip steady. He didn't care that her fingers were soft or that her wrist didn't have the skeletal grace of the women he usually encountered in his tax bracket. To Arthur, she was a masterpiece of curves and intellect. "It's not ghosts, Arthur," she said, finding a small, ironic smile. "It's just the timing. For years, Daniel made me feel like I was a glitch in his perfect life. To see him standing there, holding that poor girl's hand like a trophy, it felt like watching a movie I'd already seen the ending to. He's a small man, Flora. Small men need big diamonds to feel tall," Arthur said, his eyes darkening with a protective edge. "He has no idea that the company he's so proud of belongs to me now, or that his executive lifestyle is currently being audited by a team of forensic accountants who don't have a sense of humor." "Are you really going to fire him?" Flora asked. Arthur leaned back, a shark-like elegance in his posture. "I don't fire people out of spite, darling. I fire people for incompetence, and based on his department's quarterly projections and the way he conducts himself in public lounges, he's a liability." "But," Arthur paused, a glint of mischief appearing, "I might let him sweat for a few weeks. Let him think his seat is at the table before I pull the chair out." Flora laughed, a genuine throat-clearing sound that filled the cabin. For the first time in years, the weight she carried didn't feel like a burden of fat or shame. It felt like power. Meanwhile, back at JFK, the atmosphere in the Delta One lounge had turned radioactive. Daniel Mercer was staring at the closed elevator doors, his breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a news alert from the Wall Street Journal. "Sterling Vanguard completes hostile takeover of Apex Global. Restructuring imminent." The color didn't just leave Daniel's face. It seemed to leave his entire soul. "Daniel?" Jessica's voice was sharp, cutting through his panic. She was looking at her ring, then at him, her eyes narrowing. "Who was that man? And why did he say he owns your company?" It's business, Jess. Just high-level posturing," Daniel lied, though his voice cracked. He wiped a bead of sweat from his upper lip. "Arthur Sterling is a shark. He likes to intimidate people. It doesn't mean anything." "He called her darling, Daniel," Jessica snapped, her polished exterior beginning to crack. "And she's her. How does Flora Sinclair end up with a man who makes you look like a busboy?" "I don't know," Daniel barked, the stress finally exploding. "Maybe she got lucky. Maybe she's his cook. I don't care. We're going to Milan. We're going to have a great time." But the magic was gone. As they boarded their commercial flight, even in the high-walled sanctuary of business class, Daniel felt claustrophobic. Every time a flight attendant walked by, he imagined they were looking at him with the same pitying gaze Arthur Sterling had used. He kept looking at Jessica, who was busy taking selfies with her ring, trying to recapture the influencer glow. For the first time, Daniel noticed how thin she really was. Not model thin, but anxious thin. She was brittle. She lacked the softness, the warmth, and the quiet, steady intelligence that Flora had used to anchor him. He had traded a diamond in the rough for a piece of glass that cut him every time he touched it. The Badrutz Palace Hotel in St. Moritz stood like a Gothic fortress of indulgence against the jagged, snow-dusted peaks of the Swiss Alps. Inside, the great hall was a blur of old-world opulence, silk tapestried walls, baccarat chandeliers that cast a fractured amber glow, and the scent of expensive cigar tobacco mingled with Chanel No. 5. This was the Winter Sovereignty Gala, the annual summit where the world's true architects of wealth gathered to toast to their own invincibility. Flora stood before the floor-to-ceiling mahogany mirror in the royal suite, adjusting the drape of her custom Schiaparelli gown. It was a masterpiece in midnight emerald velvet, a fabric so deep it swallowed the light. The dress didn't hide her body. It celebrated it. The corsetry hugged her generous curves, flaring into a dramatic train that pooled around her feet like spilt ink. Around her neck sat the serpent's heart, a 50-carat Colombian emerald suspended by a delicate web of black diamonds. You're staring at the reflection of a woman who has already won, Flora. Arthur's voice vibrated through the room. He stepped out of the dressing room, adjusting his cufflinks. In his charcoal Tom Ford tuxedo, he looked every bit the titan the financial world feared. He walked over, standing behind her, his large, warm hands resting firmly on her hips. He didn't ask her to stand straighter or suck in her breath. He simply leaned down and pressed a lingering kiss to the curve of her shoulder. The room belongs to you tonight. Just remember that when we walk through those doors. I'm not nervous, Arthur, Flora said, her voice steady, surprised by her own calm. For years I felt like a ghost in my own life. Tonight I just feel solid. Good, Arthur whispered, because the lions are hungry, and I've brought them a queen to bow to. As they descended the grand marble staircase, the collective hum of the gala dipped into a sudden, pregnant silence. Heads turned. This was a crowd that prided itself on being unimpressive, yet the sight of Arthur Sterling, the man who had just swallowed 3 major tech firms in a single quarter, walking with a woman of such striking, unabashed presence, sent a ripple through the room. Flora didn't walk with the frantic, bird-like energy of the socialites around her. She moved with a slow, tectonic grace. Near the champagne fountain, Daniel Mercer was sweating. Despite the sub-zero temperatures outside, his collar felt like a noose. He had spent his last remaining liquid assets to secure 2 tickets to this event, convinced that if he could just get face-to-face with Arthur, he could charm his way out of the restructuring at Apex Global. Beside him, Jessica Kensington looked brittle. Her silver sequined gown was stunning, but she looked exhausted from the effort of maintaining her pose. Her 3-carat ring, once her pride, now felt heavy and garish in a room where women wore family heirlooms dating back to the Habsburgs. "There they are," Daniel hissed, grabbing Jessica's arm. "Keep your mouth shut and let me do the talking. We need this, Jess. If I don't get back into Sterling's good graces, the bank is going to start asking questions about the house." He intercepted them near the balcony, forcing a wide, frantic grin. "Arthur? What an incredible coincidence. I didn't realize you and Flora were making the trip to the Alps." Arthur stopped dead. The atmosphere around him turned several degrees colder. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't even acknowledge Daniel's presence with a nod. He looked at Daniel, the way a biologist looks at a particularly uninteresting specimen under a slide. "It isn't a coincidence, Mercer. I own the hotel," Arthur said, his voice a cool, terrifying monotone. "And I don't recall seeing your name on the approved guest list for the inner circle tonight." Daniel's smile faltered, but he pushed on, his desperation palpable. "I'm sure it was just a clerical error. Look, about the Apex Global transition, I've put together a proposal for the regional sales integration. I think you'll find my insights invaluable for the European market." "Daniel," Flora interrupted, her voice soft, but carrying a weight that silenced him instantly. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the hollow man she had once mistaken for a husband. "Stop. You're embarrassing the woman standing next to you." Jessica shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Flora's emerald and her own diamond. The difference was humiliating. "Flora, stay out of this," Daniel snapped, his old habit of dismissal flaring up. "This is high-level business. You wouldn't understand the complexities of—" "The complexity of fraud, Daniel?" Arthur interjected. The word hit the air like a gunshot. "Because that's what my forensic team found this morning. You didn't just mismanage the Apex accounts. You used corporate credit lines to fund this little trip. And that ring?" Arthur glanced at Jessica's hand. The invoice for that stone was buried in a marketing expense for a phantom firm you set up last year. "It's a shame, really. I dislike messy endings." The blood drained from Daniel's face so fast he looked skeletal. The socialites nearby leaned in, their fans and champagne flutes frozen. The scandal was spreading in real time. "Arthur, I can explain. The margins were tight. I was going to pay it back," Daniel stammered. "Explain it to the Swiss authorities," Arthur said. "They'll be waiting at your hotel in the morning. I've already turned over the files." Jessica let out a choked sound, a mix of a sob and a gasp. She looked at Daniel, then at the ring, then back at the powerful, radiant woman Flora had become. With a trembling hand, Jessica slid the diamond off her finger. She didn't give it back to Daniel. She walked over to the edge of the balcony and, with a flick of her wrist, tossed it into the dark, snowy abyss of the mountain pass. "I'm done," Jessica whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm not going to jail for a man who lied about his own bank balance." She turned and vanished into the crowd, leaving Daniel standing alone. Daniel reached out to grab her, but two of Arthur's security detail, men built like granite blocks, stepped into his path. "Mr. Mercer," one of them said, his voice a low warning, "your presence is no longer required. We've been instructed to escort you to the luggage bay." "Flora, talk to him," Daniel pleaded, his voice rising into a pathetic whine. "After everything we had, after the years I gave you." Flora looked at him one last time. There was no anger left in her, only a profound sense of relief. "You didn't give me years, Daniel. You took them. And tonight, I'm taking them back." She turned away from him, her emerald shimmering in the light. She took Arthur's arm, and together they walked toward the center of the ballroom. The orchestra began a lush, sweeping waltz. Arthur pulled her close, his hand firm on the small of her back, guiding her into the dance. As they spun, the world became a blur of gold and velvet. Flora felt light. For the first time in her life, she wasn't worried about the space she took up or the eyes that judged her. She was a woman loved by a giant, a woman who had found her own strength in the wreckage of a bad man's ego. Daniel was led out through the service exit, ignored by the elite he so desperately wanted to join. He was a footnote. Flora, however, was the story. As the music reached its crescendo, she leaned her head against Arthur's shoulder, watching the snow fall outside the window. A soft, white blanket covering the world, as silent and powerful as her own transformation. In the end, Daniel Mercer learned the hard way, that you can't build a kingdom on a foundation of mirrors and lies. He lost his job, his fiancée, and his dignity, all in one night. Flora Sinclair didn't just survive his cruelty. She thrived, proving that true elegance isn't found in a dress size, but in the courage to walk away and board your own jet toward a better life.